The legal system is built on facts and evidence, yet so much of how we define justice depends on how we've been taught to see one another. In this episode, we're exploring how imagery and narrative are the very tools we use to build a more just legal system. I'm Jack Newton, and welcome back to Matters. In this conversation, I'm joined in New York City by a true visionary, Harvard professor, and the founder of the Vision and Justice Project, Sarah Lewis. Here's our conversation. Sarah, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Really excited to have you right here in New York City, where you've had so much impact and spent much of your life. You've from your time at MoMA to your current role. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what makes New York so special. It's obviously a special place when it comes to culture and being a hub for culture, but maybe less obviously, it's a real center point for the pursuit of justice as well. And I'd love to hear your comments about what makes New York such a dynamic place in that regard.
Yeah, I love being a New Yorker. It's really a thrill to be here with you. Thank you for having me. I grew up in a part of town that gives you a sense of what this city offers the world. I happened to grow up on 2nd Avenue, 51st Street, just by accident of where my father was working when I was a kid, which is right by the United Nations, you know. And it's also by all the shopping districts and stuff that you kind of loved to go to as a kid. But it meant that growing up, just to even get to school, I had to contend with what was happening in the world. I remember being 7, 8, learning to know when leaders were coming to the UN because it would mean I'd have to spend more time
Right.
on the bus getting up. And it didn't seem like anything much in the moment, but as I grew, I realized how special and unique it is to have a local community remind you of what's going on in global events. So it is a locus for justice, given that site itself, but because of the power of the work of the arts and how that contributes to the narratives that define who counts and who belongs. I grew up in New York going to museums, going to these different sites, looking at these hidden levers of justice alongside what happens in a building like the United Nations, and became interested in how narratives inform the work of law. You know?
And tell me more about that spark maybe for what became the Vision and Justice Project. What did that start here in New York, and what was the
Yeah.
moment that you could trace back to that origin story?
It did start here in New York in many ways generations ago. I also have ancestors who emigrated to Ellis Island from the Caribbean.
Okay, yeah.
So one of those ancestors had my grandfather, who asked a question in a New York City public school a few decades ago now that animated the force of my life and then led to the Vision and Justice Project. He was in this class, in the history class in the 11th grade, and he just wanted to know why the textbooks didn't reflect the world around them. And it was in Brooklyn, in New York, and wanted to know where everyone was, in effect. The answer the teacher gave him transformed his life and my own. And she said, Black Americans have done nothing to merit inclusion, right? And he didn't accept that as an answer. So he asked again, and he was expelled for his so-called impertinence and refusing to accept the answer. And it was 1926. So he became an artist. He became a jazz musician, played backup with Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, traveling all around the United States. But there he was in New York, really asking this question that I only learned about when I was in sophomore year in college, wondering why, when my grandfather died that year, why he never had a high school diploma, right? And learned about what happened in New York City that year. I teach really and deal with, through the Vision and Justice Initiatives, the main question he was asking. That history teacher, what is the power of representation and narrative for determining our possibilities and futures and reality? So it began in New York, and here I am 2 generations later, a testament to what's possible, not just in this great city, but around the world. My name, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, honors my grandfather, Shadrach Emanuel Lee. His name is so much cooler than mine.
That is a great name.
But same initials, yeah.
So maybe in this vein of talking about New York and its special place in your history and of course the world history, it's a city defined by creativity
Yes.
and scale, and these are two ideas
Mhm.
you talk a lot about in your book, The Rise. And I'm curious, is there a particular place or a view in the city that you feel really captures that gift of failure you talk about, or that search for mastery in the city?
I love this question. I've never thought about it quite this way. When I wrote The Rise, which is a book about the improbable, irreplaceable foundations of creative, iconic works, uh, and failure and the near win as critical, among them, I did do it because of the energy and the dynamism of being in New York. Growing up here, as a young person, but everyone around you is grasping for a dream, and the density of the city, the energy of the city is a reminder that everyone is striving for something. So when I would go around, I would start to look at different sites of dreams not yet realized, buildings that were in states of incompletion. Roosevelt Island has one example, it's the ruins at the end of Roosevelt Island. And I would think of what someone wanted to do and what propelled them to do it. We have a lot of stories we tell ourselves about what lets us arrive at success. But when you're in a city like New York, you start to understand something that goes even beyond that. And it's what I would call and write about as mastery, right? What it means to really work towards a dream over decades, a lifetime, generations. And in that pursuit of understanding this idea more, came across a hidden aspect of this larger story that we don't often tell. We tell these stories about the full nature of mastery during commencement time, when speakers and Oprah Winfrey, you name it, will get up and publicly disclose what it really took. But it was through thinking about the power of culture and narrative that I realized how often it was propulsion that came from just coming shy of your goal, the near win, so-called failure, that really gave people the fuel that they needed to reach their dreams. So New York did a lot of that. Yeah.
And, this idea of near wins, I think and even embracing failure, I think is a really interesting topic to explore, especially in the context of the legal profession.
Yes, yes.
And this is obviously a profession that is regarded probably accurately in many cases as being very risk averse, and where failure can often have quite dire consequences for your client or for your own professional career. Can you talk about in this concept of near wins and the gift of failure, how lawyers might be able to better embrace that and learn from experience in a profession that maybe doesn't afford that as easily as others?
Yeah. I think the legal profession offers a powerful case study in thinking about the propulsion of the near win. Every court case, every outcome that might seem to be a success for one is a near win for another.
Right.
Right. And the
Yeah,
path,
by definition.
by definition, right? It's inbuilt. You can't avoid it. So what do you do in that scenario? What then allows you to keep going? Well, the good news is we are hardwired to be propelled by the near win, right? It's what I learned in researching The Rise. I learned this from Nobel Prize winning scientist Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky. You see it whenever you look more vividly at kind of Olympic competition, athletic competition. When you come just shy of your goal, you really get more granular and you focus on what you need to do to achieve it. You see that when you watch the Olympic medal stands, right? And the silver and the bronze medalists, the silver looks really dejected and the bronze medalist looks much happier. Why, right? It's counterintuitive. But in fact, that's how we're built. And so when you're able to harness the gift of the near win, you then can pivot and make change. Justice ultimately is an aggregation of near wins correcting themselves over time. Part of the way that I've entered the conversation in the legal arena is to think about what allows for that pivot after a near win. The work of reconsidering the role of narrative in a court case is often the answer. In the recent weeks, I've been fortunate to have conversations with incredible lawyers, from Brian Stevenson, the co-founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, to Deborah Archer, the head of the ACLU, Lee Gellert, Sherilyn Ifill, for example. And they're all in pursuit of justice, which is fundamentally the right to be seen as who you are, right? To transform perceptions, to determine who counts and who belongs. But these four extraordinary individuals are like so many who are seeing the power of narrative work alongside law to achieve the outcomes we need to arrive at justice in the United States. This is a generation that has finally come to see that marriage, right? The role of narrative and law for justice. In prior generations, we've looked mainly to the world of, say, entertainment, to have, say, a leader work alongside a lawmaker in a context of protest. But now we're understanding the force of narrative work. When we saw, for example, the childhood separation cases, and you talked to Lee Gellert, who was arguing in the court against these injunctions, he understood the power of those photographs and the video that was taking place to transform and sway, the imagination of the judge himself or herself. Bryan Stevenson, same thing. Why create a memorial to honor the men, women, and children's lives who were taken unjustly through the history of racial terror, lynching, if you have access to working in the legal arena and can argue before the Supreme Court? Why use the power of that narrative work of the memorial? Well, his answer is that it's indispensable. You have to transform the imagination. You have to transform perception. So that's one of the gifts that's come of this near win over the centuries. We've found a new lever, right, to work alongside law, and that's narrative and culture.
Where do you think this, what you might describe as almost an awakening to the power of this narrative and its connection to justice has really started emerging in your mind?
I think the greatest limits we ever face come from the stories we consistently tell about ourselves. And I began first to understand the power of narrative for justice when I came across an iconic image taken by an equally iconic photographer, Gordon Parks. And his photographs of the Kenneth Clark doll test, which show the choice that a young Black boy is being asked to make between two dolls, one black, one white, became foundationally important for Brown v. Board of Education. He's choosing one doll with his hand, he's choosing a white doll, but with his eyes, he's looking at this black doll. The pain, the pathos, the internal psychic state he's in, anyone can understand is unjust. That was necessary, right, for the Supreme Court lawyers to have as evidence of the inhumanity of the regime that was accepted during the day, that was supporting the transformation of Jim Crow rule into accepted fact in society. Gordon Parks' work was critical, but it wasn't just the work of Gordon Parks. He represents so many other narrative workers, right, image makers. That happened when I was very young. Recently, I think two individuals have transformed my thinking around this force, narrative work for justice. One of them is Sherilyn Ifill, an extraordinary 21st century civil rights icon, and now a colleague and comrade in this work. She approached me about Vision and Justice, the civic initiative that focuses on the power of narrative for justice. And we recently put together a convening at the Ford Foundation that brought together artists, image makers, narrative workers, lawyers, leaders of all kinds. But to do that work with a lawyer herself became for me an affirmation, a proof of concept, and inspiration for the future. We both share this, the final person in our pantheon of heroes, Congressman John Lewis, as foremost among them. And I'll never forget when I first arrived at Harvard and joined the faculty, my voicemail had this message from him inviting me to speak at what would become his penultimate Selma to Montgomery March. And I had no idea he knew about my work or Vision and Justice. I was so stunned. And that event, one in which he wanted his congressional colleagues to understand the importance of narrative for their work as lawmakers, it gave me a sense of even my own sort of understated significance of the work that I was doing. It felt as if he was seeing that the unfinished work of the civil rights movement was about the power of narrative. And that charged me to go forward.
Maybe coming back to this idea that you talk about in the rise, around near wins and the gift of failure. In the technology world, we have a culture of rapid prototyping, of failing fast, of iterating rapidly.
Yeah.
And again, this is something that the legal profession in many ways does not have as an aspect of its culture. It's very precedent based and can be slow to advance. So, I'm curious, do you see opportunities for building a better culture of experimentation, of productive experimentation, and whether it's the courts or how law offices operate? I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on that.
Yes. One of the many gifts of writing The Rise and then having invitations to speak is precisely this, to think of the cultural shifts that we can make and really must make in so many organizations, but especially those who are focusing on the laws that define the norms that we live with every day. For this, I want to think about what it means to make a decision in a group, right? We think of that as sometimes a kind of neutral space, one that might even support creativity. But what I learned in writing The Rise was that we often fail to see the innovative solution that an organization needs, that a group needs, when we don't give ourselves the private embryonic space that's necessary to embrace a risk, to embrace what could look like failure or could look like a near win, but really isn't. That came about through interviewing someone named Franklin Leonard, who created the Blacklist, which is enormously influential in the film industry now. When he created it, it was a means to allow for people to make decisions in private about unusual screenplays that in group scenarios were being lampooned as duds and failures. And there's science behind what he did. He was eliminating what happens when anyone is making a group decision, the Ash experiment, which is something that people can look up. And it's this experiment that shows that in private, you'll always really give the same answer to this question, which line here is equivalent to these other 3 lines that are very different in size and scale. But when you're faced with massive group dissent, so a lawyer facing massive precedent stating you could never win this case, the rate of you giving the correct answer in the face of that dissent drops to 25%. It's kind of massive level. And you think, well, I should be able to be the iconoclast, right? I should be able to still persevere. But what we found, what researchers cognitively have found that it takes is not just that insistence on your own will, but a culture that supports privation and those embryonic spaces in which you don't have to face group dissent. So working together is useful and helpful, but it doesn't always lead to iconoclastic, innovative ideas that a society needs, that a lawyer needs, that a technologist needs, that a creative person needs. And so a lot of the talks that I'll do around The Rise for organizations, many in the field of technology, involve thinking through the cultural changes that can take place in an organization. I mean, we live with so many of those cultural changes. Google, for example, would have privation, time for the engineers to devote to pet projects that might work for the company, that might not. And through it, we got Gmail, right? So what is this strange little thing? Oh, okay, actually can work to help us. There are lots of other modes that organizations have used to create those embryonic spaces. And so I think the legal arena is one that can benefit from that. You could argue that Brian Stevenson creating his own legacy site space, right, in Montgomery, Alabama, is a mode of privation, is a way to get people to, through the force of narrative, reconsider the not just legality, but the rights that we uphold through laws, but outside of the legal arena itself. So come and experience this monument and marker, reconsider the legal history of the United States, and then go back to your work, as lawmakers, right?
So this is just a fascinating vein in my mind. When you look at, whether you want to call them, best practices or something else, but when you look at these groups trying to accomplish creative things, think outside of the box, are the ideas you're talking about really connected to the idea of psychological safety, where you need an environment that you can think about ideas in a a different way, or what else can groups do to
Mhm.
cultivate this innovative thinking? Because again, I think it's something that in such a precedent oriented profession, that thinking outside of the box, whether it's how you adopt legal technology in your
Yes.
practice or how you embrace AI in your
Yes.
practice, which is obviously a much discussed topic in law firms right now,
Mm.
or even how you might argue a case, in an innovative and
Mm.
different way.
Yeah.
What do you see as whether it's in law firms or just as in a more general context, what teams can do to create and foster that environment of creativity?
Yeah. I want to answer this in two ways. I first want to address, I think, a significant part of this, which is about risk taking. Um, it isn't all about making risk taking more safe, but yes, I think that is really crucial for this conversation. Um, but you're getting at what I think is inspiring so many lawyers to move outside of the profession to find solutions for cultural change. Why does a lawyer like Brian Stevenson or Sherilyn Ifill devote a lion's share of their work towards the experimentation that can happen in the arts, right? What does it say about what's not taking place, right, in their own industry or arena? The 14th Amendment Center that Sherilyn created is looking towards artists as the creators of an experimental laboratory. We're thinking through how society can redefine itself, effectively. And and many artists like Hank Wells Thomas and others have considered Brian Stevenson one of our new conceptual artists in the 21st century, not just a lawyer, right? Why? Why? And it's not a theoretical question. This is what they're really spending their time doing. And it is to create a space in which risk taking can be more safe. It isn't just to do with what cognitive theory tells us we need to for decision making. They're really seeing and inaugurating the power of the creative process as one that we have to take seriously for how we're going to move forward to transform culture in our society.
And when you look at the concept that you talk about of representational
Yeah.
excellence
Yeah.
from the Vision and Justice Project,
Yeah.
um, and you think about how that might apply to legal technology.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how that concept would apply to legal technology, and
Mhm.
how you would think about a metric for success for a company like Clio or any legal technology provider, when they're thinking about a metric that they want to measure, a success metric, in terms of how well their technology is delivering on a mandate for equity and inclusion.
Yeah. One of the growth edges we have in the tech industry is marrying the rightful image, right, of the entire world with how our technology, fashions representation, right? One of the more recent initiatives from Vision and Justice is its impact on Google. There we have just a case study in how we all have to really think about the impact of representation on machine learning, which is helpful for a lot of the work that we do, but also has limits, within it. I was really inspired by having at the time, a really young marketer from Google take Vision and Justice, my course at Harvard, and learn about the limits of machine learning and representation and race and AI, and realize that he had a solution that he could offer Google, and created Project Douglas based on this work, which created image equity in the camera, really for the first time through the Google Pixel 6 phone. And it's an example of what can happen when you actually reckon with the limits of technology and or work to find a solution and understand why you're working to find a solution. In the legal arena, there are downstream effects of incorrect image capture, right, of an individual. There are potentially fatal outcomes that can result in this. And this doesn't, and affects many different industries, but has real consequences in yours. And so the reckoning that this marketer, Florian Koenigsberger, was able to affect in Google is the type of reckoning that needs to happen in the adjacent arena of the legal field as well.
So, Sarah, do you have an idea of a specific design principle or research methodology that tech companies should prioritize to ensure that our tools are not just accessible, but genuinely helpful to lawyers serving the most marginalized and underserved communities?
I want to first just reflect on why it matters. Ultimately, I mean, we're talking about technology as a tool, but what is it really a tool for, right? In many ways, I think what's underlying your question is that it's a tool for proper representation,
Right.
right?
Increasing access to justice,
Mm-hmm.
delivering better legal outcomes to more people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're now at a moment we're really acknowledging the power of representation and narrative if we're going to live out the full rights that we've been accorded here in the United States.
Maybe pulling on a thread there, when we think about specifically the impacts of AI today and the fact that much of AI is trained on historical data, some of which, or much of which, will have systemic bias embedded within that data, we can see AI potentially amplifying those historical biases rather
Right.
than mitigating them.
That's right.
What can we do about that? What can we make sure? How can we ensure that some of the either visual or analytical outputs of these AI models are not propagating or even amplifying those historical biases?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing we must do is educate ourselves and be aware that that is happening. Great work is being done by a lot of my colleagues that are technologists on this. Joy Balam-Winnie, foremost among them, Sophia Noble, Florian Königsberger, Timnit Gebru, and others. Educating yourself on why we have the history of systemic injustice legible in even our smartphone technology and our cameras is important, because then you start to understand the why, why we have to work to make these changes. When you look at the history of scientific racism, right, you look at the power that the photograph had to shore up these narratives and regimes of who counts and who belongs racially, you see that the photograph has never just been a neutral technology. It's always been weaponized to honor human life and to denigrate it. But even the chemical emulsion technology, right, in the photograph has been used as a way to register and to determine who counts and who belongs. Kodak legendarily didn't shift its chemical emulsions for film until chocolate companies and furniture companies complained to them about the inability to sell their goods, because you couldn't show the difference between this kind of wood and my skin tone, for example, until they made a change and asked effectively, what's the story here, right? Is the story that we're going to only privilege a lighter skin market, which was consciously what they had done, right? Which is what the archive shows. Or are we going to allow for the full chromatic range to be shown, right? And they did innovate a technology, Kodak Gold. That was the film that my parents used when I was growing up. We have a really kind of vast range of skin tones in my family. So to resolve us all in one image, that was what was required, right? And it was a way for Kodak to reckon with itself, but it's also a way for us to consider the why of why we need to reckon. Well, AI gives us this opportunity to really think about what story we want to tell about society and to look at the history of historic injustices that have led to what we sometimes take to just be neutral, chemical inputs in a phone. So AI extends the story that I've just told with the history of the photograph, because we have the downstream effects of those decisions and embedded in digital technology, the camera and the moving image. And that work, you can just see, compounds on itself. So to support the work of technologists who are working to undo how machine learning propagates those histories is really critical now, because it's not only about the ability to see yourself as you want to be seen. It's about understanding that industries, whether they're organizations, corporations that are sourcing new employees by using digital means to match photographs that are sent in alongside, resumes and are being filtered out, based upon biases, right, the machine learning has, or whether it's public health initiatives that are not able to diagnose properly, right? You have a whole range of outcomes that are born of this failure to see the why, behind right-siding this relationship between representation and technology. And we have a chance to get it right in this generation, I think. We have, in this moment, not just a range of leaders who are focusing on this work, and I'm grateful to be among them, but I think a society that is in a state of true contestation and crisis, right, around the story we're telling ourselves about who we are, and with severe consequences, right, for human life.
So I love the optimism about the opportunity here, but
Yeah.
also, AI is much more of a black box than, I love the example of the photograph you use, and this is at least an observable chemical emulsion that you can analyze, and you can see the photograph, and you can literally see you're not represented in the photograph in really concrete terms. AI provides this level of, indirection and opaqueness that actually, being able to understand what the algorithm is doing, and if some of these biases are being applied and filtering out your job application for some reason that you can't see or scrutinize or really extract from the algorithm. I'm curious, are there any principles around, design or transparency or observability that you think we need to be approaching this AI era to have any hope of actually making the kind of progress that I love that you're optimistic about, but there's certainly cause to be skeptical given how abstract a lot of these models are, and how little we actually understand how they're working.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I should say, I come from a tradition where despair just isn't an option, right? I think when you look at the Black tradition, like, that's so core to it. So it's my orientation in general. And I have reason to also despair when I think about AI in that context too. I was given an opportunity a few years back to beta test ChatGPT with Vision before it came out. And, in that experience, was really devastated by some of what I was seeing could happen. Asking a simple prompt, show me an image of a leader, would, call up images that showed bias, right? That didn't show the full range of who should be able to be considered as a leader, and exposed so many of the internalized biases and narratives that we walk around the world with and filter the world with. So yeah, I have reasons to not be optimistic too, but ultimately am, because we do have the means to then, once you're faced with that state of failure, effectively, look ourselves square in the eye and say, all right, we need to challenge our understanding of who counts as the ideal, who is the universal, which is all of what the machine learning is based upon. What's the ideal outcome for this input, right? We're not doing it anymore you called it AI, a black box, and it is, but we're not doing it in the shadowed, secret state anymore, right?
Right.
There's enough, we're having this conversation because there's fantastic public discourse, right, about it. And so many of my students at Harvard and beyond, when I'm speaking in so many of these different arenas, are invested in it, are changing their life course to be part of the dialogue. So if we hide the urgency of the moment, we're going to suppress, I think, the energy that's coming in that's saying, no, there isn't reason to despair because we can get this right, actually. It just is going to require that we're very honest about the marriage of image and narrative and power that's centralized around our ideas about race, frankly,
I share your optimism, by the way. I describe myself sometimes as a pathological optimist, and
I
think
love that.
you need to be, to get through life sometimes. And you're right. There's entire fields of research dedicated to this, and people dedicating their lives pursuing PhDs on this topic. And I think we'll make progress, but I do think the technological barriers are significant.
Yeah.
Maybe on this notion of the power of narrative, I want to talk about what I think a lot of lawyers are struggling with now, which is in the era of AI, where AI can perhaps, very capably draft a legal argument for them, help them build a legal strategy that will work, help them do what might have been, days worth of legal research in a matter of minutes. Lawyers are kind of left wondering, what is the uniquely human thing that I'm equipped to do that I can have impact and be focusing my time and energy on? And I'm wondering, when you consider your field of study and your body of work, what you might give lawyers as advice on that front.
It's a beautiful question. And it's one we're all asking ourselves. What is the value of my contribution in the face of the power of technology as a human being, right? One of the central gifts of the lawmaker and of the individual is to consider what we don't know, right? About ourselves, about each other. And as the legal arena continues to centralize and understand the power of narrative work, we come closer to seeing the singular gift, right, of the human mind, even in the face of technology. It doesn't have the gift of showing you what you don't know, right? That's what the human imagination can do. And that's what the power of culture can do, of narrative can do. A dear friend and musician has said, Wynton Marsalis, you can't move past the technology of the soul,
right?
Of the spirit. And only we know what it's going to take to persuade the human mind and heart to say, that scenario is unjust, right? ChatGPT doesn't know how to do that yet. And never will.
I love that. What you're articulating here is really that the human experience is really about, and where we should be focusing our energy is in this unique capability we've got to connect with others through narrative.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is the hidden story behind the work of justice and the work in the legal arena.
Sarah, if we look at our conversation, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I think this idea around, the visual impact, the impact of narrative on law, on driving really positive outcomes in law is one through line. Do you think law schools should make a course on something like visual culture in law? Mandatory for all JDs. It feels like something that, you've clearly articulated has been so profoundly important in what we would view as turning points in American history. And yet it feels like a relatively underappreciated aspect of the field.
If I am teaching my course at Harvard Law School in the upcoming years, you'll know it's because you inspired the idea just now. Yes. And I have so many colleagues at the law school there and others who draw on the pedagogy behind division and justice in their courses for that reason. It is critical for lawmakers to understand how to both use narrative in how they fashion arguments and to see the critical role it's had when law has failed and for it to not fail, right, over time. You have to remember that the use of images, of visual culture in the courts was confusing actually at first when it began, because it meant contending with what you've just described, the narrative power, right, of culture. It became clear that just letting a photograph into the courtroom was something other than letting a map in or a diagram. And the question became, why? Well, the force of the narrative that the culture contains is why. So if lawyers don't understand this, they're bereft of a critical tool that they absolutely need. And Vision and Justice instructs the students in understanding this before they might even get to law school. Yeah.
Well, look, Sarah, this time has flown by. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks again for joining me today.
Such an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
One of my biggest takeaways from Sarah was the idea of representational excellence, the responsibility we have as technologists and lawyers to ensure our tools reflect the full humanity of the people they serve. If you enjoyed this episode of Matters, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Jack Newton, and thanks for listening to Matters.